Welcome and thank you for joining me on my video series on emotional wellness. This is part one where I'll be talking about the differences between burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. The importance of really talking about the differences and feeling that really is a way of just really naming what your experience is like and what you're going through so that you can make a more informed decision moving forward about what kind of help you might need or what kind of practices you might need to dive into as far as how to take care of yourself on an ongoing basis. You may be watching this because you do work in direct service. You might be frontline worker, a caregiving position, or working in education, working in environments that are really either traumatized environments or at risk for having a lot of trauma around you. So like I said, this is really the step of naming your experience to really inform what next step you need to take. So I may even include here ways that engaging with nature or being outdoors can really support some of these, or just to give you a sense of what do you need to do after hearing the differences between these emotional states. So one thing I want to note before we get started is I am a trained and professional coach. I call myself a transformational coach because I really focus on the process of bringing my clients through a transformation. So starting from one phase or one way of being and feeling into another, and utilizing the knowledge that nature holds. By no means does any of this information that I share with you replace anything that your doctor or licensed or clinical professional can offer. So I still do encourage, and I will always say, seek that help as well if you find yourself needing that, and if that comes up as the video goes through. All right, so let's get started. The first term I want to talk about today is burnout. And you may have heard this term. A lot of folks say, I'm burnt out. What is that? To me, when I hear that term burnout, it really is what it sounds like. You have a flame that guides your passion, and that flame is just really dim or it's out. And due to just the ongoing work and pile of work, maybe, and the demand of what you do every day. So, burnout being just like your flame is out, your energy level, there's a significant decrease in your energy to be present and perform at your best. So at this stage of just burnout, like, you're still pretty aware that your gas tank is running on low, and you're able to consciously make that decision that you need maybe like a mental wellness day and take that day off. Or what you do already is just take walks out after, your job, or after a situation had just happened, that you need to take a walk to kind of set yourself back up and get grounded. So you're already proactive about caring for yourself. And burnout is, maybe that's the nature of your work and you just have to have that. But there's nothing really impacting how you see or view the world, or how you act or behave on a normally. Now let's go on to the next term, which does affect a little bit more than just your energy, and that's compassion fatigue. So what is compassion fatigue? This term is really more of an occupational term. It sounds like you're just really tired of having compassion. So really it is caregiving positions, taking care of others, maybe is your job. I often think that it doesn't really even have to be our job. Sometimes within our family units or community position, we are naturally the caregivers. And so sometimes you may feel like, in your personal life, you are the caregiver of your family. You are the caregiver for your community. And that's that's what role you are, and that's who you are. Now, fatigue means that, it's accumulating. Your giving from your cup is so much so that you're depleted to the point that it is now starting to show up in your mental state and emotional weight, and maybe even feeling physical sensations from the stress, pains in your bodies. Those are signals that something is really being compromised a lot. So, this is just really natural for caregivers. Me being one myself, it's really something that I've had to learn, because naturally caregivers have a hard time understanding what their boundaries are, or need to have that process of really developing boundaries. Not only that, but learning a process of enforcing those with those around them and themselves. So it's just really a natural thing to give. And it also means that paying attention to where you're giving a little bit too much. Compassion fatigue means that you've gotten to the point where, your body is starting to tell you that you're giving too much. The language that you use tends to be a negative outlook. And so your emotions are also attached to those negative beliefs. And so it's sort of this compounding thing where you're fatiguing this ability that you have to be compassionate, and your body and your way of being has been impacted. So in those cases, really it just feels like, there's another component of even, caregivers like constantly just not stopping the caregiving. And that could also be a component of, in the mindset, there's this kind of learned behavior that if you don't caregive, who else will? And there's also piling guilt. If you don't do something, there's something at stake there. So those may be components compounding the effects of the impacts and the decision not to stop caregiving. But what that's doing is really just depleting the person to a point, right? And it's at risk of harming others. So we want to pay attention to that compassion fatigue, and whether we're drawing good boundaries and able to enforce them. As far as what to do about this, there's a lot. It's all dependent on who you are and what kind of state you're in with this compassion fatigue. It's beyond that low energy level though, and it's beyond the proactive step that you need to take. It's really in compassion fatigue. Sometimes you might need that extra support. Somebody might reflect it back to you that you're at that state and you don't realize it. So what do you do then is really, the self-care practices, take that up a notch, really maybe get some support around being accountable to taking care of yourself, taking time for yourself here and there. Scheduling standing dates to go out into nature with somebody that you want to be with and that can listen and be with you during that outing, or someone who knows what you're going through. Going out and seeking help intentionally to work on those negative beliefs, maybe helping you with reframing, letting go of residual energies that you might be taking on from the work that you do or the incidents that happen in your life. Really compassion fatigue is an opportunity for you to find ways to really release the things that you're taking on that you don't need. We could get into a lot more of that. I think one clear thing was when I started doing my healing hikes. The healing hikes were really designed for this state of compassion, having compassion fatigue, and safely releasing that into nature with the intentional process that I hold. So now that we got a little bit of taste of that, let's move on to vicarious trauma. So I was using this term when I first started my healing hikes because I experienced that in some of my work. I witnessed what vicarious trauma looked like in other people. Now, I want to just use this time to let you know how I define it and how it might show up. And maybe there are resources out there that you feel like you should reach out and take. But really, I want to cover like what this term is and how it might show up. And I think it's important to note that even though it's trauma, there's so much more to cover about trauma. This I'm just talking about is vicarious trauma. So what is that? It's, we're familiar with that term when people say, hey, I'm living vicariously through you. Well, you could live somebody else's trauma, especially if you're working in direct service to those who have experienced trauma and are trying to work that through. So, as to recognize it in yourself, it's it goes beyond that burnout of like just being tired. Compassion fatigue can lead to vicarious trauma. So if you're not taking care of that fatigue, vicarious trauma is where it could get to. And so what's the difference between compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma? Well, in vicarious trauma, you actually start to adopt a lot of the truths and beliefs about those traumas, and you normalize it for yourself. So you don't have to have compassion fatigue to have vicarious trauma. You could just have vicarious trauma. And we'll get more into that hopefully when we bring in the organization Wellness in Action in part 2. But for now, what could vicarious trauma look like? Well, whether you're constantly in environments that are traumatized or trauma is occurring and happening to people, and you're working with that, or you're in that environment, you're prone to take on that trauma and energy. And so it could impact you just by even like hearing those stories over and over and over again. And it becomes vicarious trauma when you hear it over and over again, and there isn't a proper way to like release and let that go and say that that is their truth and not mine, or there are other ways that this world functions, and this is a traumatic way versus not. But you, without drawing healthy boundaries around that, you can and are at risk for adopting those beliefs. So if you're working with people who are telling you their stories of trauma, and you're in that environment to just, it doesn't get released or compartmentalized or processed in a safe way, and it's just this constant stories of this, then you start to see that person for their actual trauma, not as a whole person having other kinds of stories and abilities and possibilities around them, they just become the trauma story, and you start to believe that that is a normal thing. So it does happen with some of these caregiving positions if it's not processed well. So, you know, for my personal experience working in youth prisons, being around adults who are always around the youth, there became this. I witnessed, you know, some of this adopting that that's who these youth were, that they were their convictions, and that's how they proceeded their days, by expecting them to do those things. And so that doesn't transform them out of that environment. It enables that, because vicarious trauma is there and is normalizing that. All right. So there's a lot to unpack about that, and I don't think the part one is really for unpacking that, but I did want to introduce these concepts to you just to get you started in thinking about what your emotional state may be, especially in these times of the pandemic, where we have these opportunities to really think about where emotionally we are while we're also going through a lot of it. There is a lot of trauma going around, and to be able to see that there are different things happening, maybe different feelings going on. Sometimes it's just such a traumatic thing that we don't know where to go next. So hopefully discerning, letting you know the differences between burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma will give you some insights for yourself as far as what experience are you having during these times, or what experiences are you witnessing in others. All right. Well, that's a lot. I want to thank you for listening to part one of this emotional wellness series. We're going to move on to part two and bring in Wellness in Action, an organization in Oakland. And just to let you know, they are the ones who really trained me up as a coach and a practitioner, working with service providers that may have some of these components that they need to process with my healing hikes. So really want to shout them out for giving me such a great opportunity to be trained on these terms. I don't call my hikes vicarious trauma anymore, because really I can't identify where they are when they come on. So really what I'm doing is compassion fatigue hikes, and that makes more sense. And that makes me feel really good about holding space the way that I am, to know that I could name that. So hopefully for you, this provides some insight and conceptual understanding of these really challenging times we're dealing with. And some of us have already been. And I look forward to bringing in Patricia and maybe Laura from Wellness in Action. If you have not subscribed to my channel, subscribe to it now so that you get word of when part two launches, and you can listen to that. I will leave all the information on how to get a hold of me and my information for my work. Please leave me any comments, questions, other things you want to hear about. And let's just keep continuing this conversation, because I think information like this is really, really needed for our communities right now as we shelter in place, and as we're really moving into a world where we're going to have to bring a lot more compassion and cooperation to make it all happen. I look forward to connecting with you again. Thank you for listening.